Melissa's heart pounded in her chest as she darted through the crowded city streets. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath ragged, knowing Andrew was not far behind. Andrew, her father's creditor, was determined to force her into marriage to settle a $50,000 debt her father owed him. The thought of marrying Andrew, a man old enough to be her father, filled her with dread. She needed to find a way out, and fast. Ahead, she spotted Nelson Donald, the billionaire's son, on his way to work. He was surrounded by a few security men, his tall frame and confident stride making him easy to spot. Nelson had always been kind to her, and in that moment of panic, she saw him as her lifeline. Without thinking, she sprinted towards him. "Nelson!" she called out, her voice trembling. Before he could react, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. The world seemed to stop as their lips met. Nelson stiffened in surprise, his eyes wide with shock, but he quickly understood the situation as he saw Andrew approaching, anger blazing in his eyes. Nelson's grip tightened around Melissa, and he pulled her closer, playing along. "Melissa, there you are. I've been looking for you," he said loudly, his voice steady and reassuring. Andrew skidded to a halt a few feet away, his face contorted with fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, glaring at Nelson. Nelson kept his composure, his eyes never leaving Andrew's. "Melissa is with me," he said firmly. "She's my girlfriend. You need to leave her alone." Andrew's face turned red with rage. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing a finger at Melissa. "I'll be back." With that, he stormed off, leaving Melissa trembling in Nelson's arms. Nelson gently pulled back, looking down at her with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Melissa nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Nelson. I didn't know what else to do." Nelson gave her a reassuring smile. "It's okay." He led her back inside the house and promised to see her when he returned from work. Melissa Thompson has been working for the Nelson family as their maid for the past 3 years. Due to her parents' financial difficulties, she works hard to save money and support them. As their only child, it is challenging for her to provide for her parents and take care of herself. She met Nelson one day while cleaning, and it was love at first sight. However, she believed it could never happen because she came from a poor background and thought someone like Nelson wouldn't be with her. As the day turned into night, Melissa felt a mix of gratitude and guilt for kissing her boss' son. She waited patiently in the living room for Nelson to return from work and apologize. It was past 9 p.m. when Nelson returned after spending hours in traffic. He opened the door, heading to his room, and suddenly, Melissa was there. "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier today," Melissa began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have dragged you into my mess." Nelson shook his head. "Don't apologize. I'm just glad I was there to help." Melissa took a deep breath, deciding it was time to tell him everything. "My father, Williams, he owes Andrew $50,000. We don't have that kind of money, and Andrew, he wants me to marry him to clear the debt." Nelson's expression turned serious. "That's horrible. How did your father get into so much debt?" "He borrowed money for a business venture that failed. Now Andrew is using it to control us," she explained, tears slipping down her cheeks. Nelson felt a surge of protectiveness. He had always admired Melissa from afar, her strength and kindness standing out to him. The kiss that morning, though unexpected, had been the best part of his day. Now, hearing about her plight, he knew he had to help her. "You don't have to go through this alone, Melissa," Nelson said gently. "I can help you with the debt." Melissa looked up at him, her eyes filled with hope and uncertainty. "But why? Why would you do that for me?" Nelson hesitated, then decided to confess his feelings. "I've liked you for a long time, Melissa. I just never had the courage to tell you because I thought my parents wouldn't approve. They want me to marry Betty Stone for business reasons." Melissa's heart skipped a beat. She had always felt a connection with Nelson, but never dared to hope he might feel the same. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, overwhelmed. "You don't have to say anything right now," Nelson replied, taking her hand in his. "Just know that I'm here for you, and I won't let Andrew hurt you." For the first time in a long while, Melissa felt a glimmer of hope. Nelson's presence gave her strength, and she knew she could face whatever challenges lay ahead with him by her side. The next day, Nelson sat at the dining table, his parents, Jonathan and Michelle Donald, seated across from him. The tension in the room was palpable. Jonathan, a stern-looking man in his 60s, leaned forward, his expression serious. Michelle, elegant and composed, nodded in agreement with her husband's unspoken sentiment. "Nelson," Jonathan began, "we need to discuss your engagement to Betty Stone. The partnership between our families is crucial for the future of our business." Nelson sighed, looking down at his plate. "Dad, I understand the importance of the business, but I don't love Betty. I can't marry someone I don't love." Michelle's gaze softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Love can grow, Nelson. Betty is a good match for you. She's from a respected rich family and understands our world." Nelson felt a pang of frustration. His parents couldn't see beyond the surface. They didn't understand his feelings for Melissa, the maid who had worked for their family for years. She was kind, hardworking, and everything he had ever dreamed of in a partner. "Mom, Dad, there's something you don't know," Nelson said quietly, gathering his courage. "I'm in love with someone else." Jonathan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Who?" he demanded. "Melissa," Nelson admitted, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I love Melissa. She's been working for us for years, and she's an incredible person." Jonathan's face turned red with anger. "Melissa? The maid? Are you out of your mind, Nelson? She's from a poor background. She doesn't belong in our world." Michelle looked at her son with a mix of disappointment and concern. "Nelson, you need to think about your future. Marrying Melissa would bring scandal and ruin our reputation." Nelson clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. "I'm not ashamed of loving Melissa. She's kind, intelligent, and honest. She's everything I've ever wanted in a partner." Jonathan slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes clatter. "This conversation is over, Nelson. You will marry Betty Stone, and that's final." The next morning, the Donald mansion buzzed with activity. As Nelson prepared for the day, a commotion at the front door caught his attention. He hurried downstairs to find Andrew standing in the foyer, his face twisted with anger. "Where's Melissa?" Andrew demanded, his voice echoing through the grand hall. Nelson stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What do you want, Andrew?" Andrew sneered. "You know exactly what I want. Melissa is supposed to marry me. Your little stunt won't change that." Nelson's jaw tightened. "I'm willing to pay off the debt. Just leave her alone." Andrew's eyes gleamed with malice. "Money isn't the issue here. I want Melissa." At that moment, Jonathan and Michelle, drawn by the raised voices, came downstairs. "What's going on here?" Jonathan asked, his gaze shifting between Andrew and Nelson. Nelson took a deep breath. "Andrew is here to take Melissa. I offered to pay off the debt, but he refuses. He wants to force her into marriage." "That's good news!" Jonathan exclaimed. "Your so-called lover is soon to be someone else's wife." "Thank you so much," Andrew said. "Her father owes me money, and she is the repayment. And your son here is preventing me from taking my wife to be home." Melissa, who had been hiding nearby, stepped into the room, her face pale but determined. "I won't marry you, Andrew. I love Nelson." Jonathan and Michelle stared at their son, their shock evident. "What?" Michelle whispered, her voice trembling. Nelson took Melissa's hand, his resolve unwavering. "I love Melissa, and she loves me. We want to be together." Jonathan's anger flared. "This is absurd. She's a maid. How could you, Nelson?" Michelle's eyes filled with tears. Nelson, think about what you're doing. This will destroy our family. Nelson looked at his parents, his heart aching. I'm sorry, but I can't live my life according to your plans. I love Melissa, and I'm willing to fight for her. Andrew's face twisted with rage. This isn't over, Nelson. You'll regret this. Jonathan turned to Andrew. I will surely hand over Melissa to you. My son already has someone else to marry. Jonathan reassured him. As Andrew stormed out, the tension in the room remained thick. Jonathan and Michelle glared at their son, their disappointment palpable. Nelson, you have no idea what you've done, Jonathan said, his voice tight with anger. Michelle shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You've broken our hearts, Nelson. How could you choose her over your own family? Nelson tightened his grip on Melissa's hand, his heart heavy but resolute. I'm sorry, but I can't change how I feel. I love Melissa, and I'm going to be with her, no matter what. Michelle, in a fit of rage, slapped Melissa across the face. You've ruined everything! Michelle screamed at Melissa. Melissa's eyes welled up with tears, but she stood her ground. Nelson quickly moved to shield her, his own anger rising. Mom, that was uncalled for! Melissa doesn't deserve this! Nelson said firmly. Just then, Betty Stone, who had been quietly observing the drama, stepped forward. Betty had always seemed reserved, bound by her parents' expectations. But seeing Melissa treated so harshly, something snapped inside her. Mrs. Donald, this isn't right, Betty said, her voice steady and calm. Melissa isn't to blame for any of this. She's in love with Nelson, and he loves her back. Michelle turned to Betty, stunned by her boldness. What are you talking about, Betty? He's your husband-to-be. Betty continued, her gaze unwavering. I know I'm supposed to marry Nelson. I understand what it feels like to be trapped. There's something I need to tell you all. Betty then looked at Nelson, a hint of relief in her eyes. Nelson, I'm in love with someone else. I don't want this arranged marriage any more than you do. Nelson blinked, surprised but grateful. Betty, I had no idea. Who is he? His name is Daniel. He's an artist, Betty confessed, a small smile forming. But my parents would never approve. They want me to marry you to strengthen our family's business ties. Nelson nodded, understanding her plight. Betty, we can help each other. If we stand together, maybe we can convince our parents to let us follow our hearts. Betty's unexpected alliance brought a sense of hope. Let's work together, she said, offering her hand. For both our sakes. Jonathan and Michelle's eyes widened at what Betty had just said. They couldn't keep watching what was unfolding before their very own eyes and left in silence, heading to their room. That afternoon, Nelson and Melissa sat down with Betty to come up with a plan. They needed solid evidence against Andrew to free Melissa from his grip. Betty mentioned her brother Jack, who was a police officer. He could help them gather the necessary proof. Later that day, they met with Jack at a small cafe. Jack listened intently as Nelson and Melissa explained the situation. He agreed to help, knowing how dangerous Andrew could be. We need to be careful, Jack warned. Andrew has connections, but if we can get enough evidence, we can take him down. Over the next few weeks, they worked together, gathering information and piecing together Andrew's illegal activities. Nelson and Melissa grew closer during this time, sharing stolen moments of affection. They hugged, kissed, and even went on a mini-date, enjoying simple pleasures amidst the chaos. One evening, after a particularly long day of investigating, Nelson and Melissa sat on a park bench, holding hands. Melissa, I'm more determined than ever to protect you, Nelson said softly. We'll get through this together. Melissa leaned her head on his shoulder. I know we will. Thank you for standing by me. Their bond strengthened with each passing day, fueling their resolve to fight for their love. With enough evidence in hand, Melissa decided it was time to confront her parents, Nelson Jack and Betty also came along. They returned to the Thompson household, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Williams and Rebecca Thompson were taken aback by their visit. "Nelson, Melissa, what brings you here?" Williams asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. Nelson stepped forward, holding Melissa's hand. "We have something important to tell you. Andrew has been involved in illegal activities, and we have proof." Rebecca's eyes widened. "What kind of activities?" Jack, who had accompanied them, handed over a file. "These documents detail Andrew's dealings. He's been laundering money and engaging in other criminal acts." Williams and Rebecca looked through the documents, their faces growing pale. "This is unbelievable," Williams muttered. "But why are you telling us this?" Nelson took a deep breath. "Because I love Melissa, and I want to protect her." Williams was shocked to hear this. "But you're the son of a billionaire. Why choose Melissa?" "Because I have always loved her, and she loves me as well. Please, I want you to stop forcing Melissa to marry Andrew. I can't let that happen, and I'm willing to pay all the money you borrowed from Andrew," Nelson said confidently, looking at Williams. Rebecca's eyes softened as she looked at Melissa. "Is this true, Melissa? Do you love him?" Melissa nodded. "Yes, Mom. I love Nelson, and he loves me. We want to be together." Williams sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is a lot to take in. But if what you're saying is true, we can't let Melissa marry Andrew." Jack further explained to Williams all the illegal activities involving Andrew. Betty, who had come with them for support, then spoke up. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. Nelson and I aren't in love with each other. Our engagement was arranged by our parents, but it's not what we want." Williams and Rebecca looked at each other, then back at Betty and Nelson. "So, what did your parents say about it?" Williams asked. Betty took a deep breath. "Nelson and I have talked to my parents and told them that we don't love each other. We have canceled the marriage arrangements. They're disappointed, but I convinced them to continue doing business with the Donalds. I want to be with the man I love, and Nelson wants to be with Melissa." Williams and Rebecca exchanged glances. Finally, Williams nodded. "If that's what you both want, then we will support you. It's time to end this charade." Relief washed over Nelson and Melissa. They had won the support of her family and exposed Andrew for his crimes. It was a new beginning, one where they could finally be together without fear. As they left the Thompson house, Nelson squeezed Melissa's hand. "We did it," he said, smiling. Melissa smiled back, tears of joy in her eyes. "Yes, we did. Thank you, Nelson, for everything." 2 days later, they decided to pay Andrew a surprise visit. Andrew stood in the dimly lit office, his face pale as he looked over the evidence that Jack, Betty's brother, had gathered. He knew his time was up. The documents detailed his illegal activities, leaving no room for escape. Nelson and Melissa stood side by side, their determination unwavering. "Andrew, it's over," Nelson said firmly. "We have everything we need to bring you down. Leave Melissa alone or face the consequences." Andrew's eyes flickered with anger and fear. He knew he had no choice. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walk away," Nelson replied. "Drop your claim on Melissa and her family. In exchange, we'll settle the debt and keep this information to ourselves." Andrew clenched his fists, but knew he was beaten. "Fine," he spat. "I'll leave her alone, but I want the settlement by the end of the week." "Deal," Nelson said, extending his hand. Andrew hesitated, then shook it, sealing the agreement. Williams, who had been watching silently, stepped forward, his face lined with regret. "Melissa, I owe you an apology," he began, his voice trembling. "I never should have put you in this position. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I promise to change, to be a better father." Melissa's eyes softened as she looked at her father. "Thank you, Dad. I just want us to be a family again." It took some weeks for the Donald family to gradually accept Melissa as Nelson's wife-to-be. Jonathan and Michelle were initially resistant, but seeing the love and commitment between Nelson and Melissa began to soften their hearts. One evening, Nelson and Melissa were sitting in the garden, enjoying the cool breeze. Michelle approached them, her expression gentle. "Melissa," she said softly, "I want to apologize for how I've treated you. It's clear that you and Nelson truly love each other. We were wrong to judge you based on your background. Welcome to the family." Tears welled up in Melissa's eyes as she hugged Michelle. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means so much to me." With Andrew out of the picture and both families beginning to accept their relationship, Nelson and Melissa could finally look forward to a future together. They spent their days planning their wedding and dreaming about the life they would build. A week later, Betty met up with Nelson and Melissa at a cozy cafe. She was beaming with happiness. "Guess what?" she said excitedly. "My parents agreed to give Daniel a chance. They're willing to meet him." "That's wonderful, Betty," Melissa exclaimed, hugging her. "I'm so happy for you. And thank you for everything." Nelson smiled, feeling a sense of peace. It looks like everything is falling into place. The day of the wedding arrived, and the Donald mansion was filled with family and friends. Nelson stood at the altar, his heart pounding with anticipation. When Melissa walked down the aisle, her eyes locked with his, and everything else faded away. As they exchanged vows, Nelson's voice was steady with emotion. "Melissa, you've shown me what true love is. I promise to stand by you, to love you, and to protect you, always." Melissa smiled through her tears. "Nelson, you've been my rock, my partner, and my love. I promise to cherish you, to support you, and to love you with all my heart." They sealed their vows with a kiss, and the crowd erupted in applause. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration of love overcoming all obstacles. After the ceremony, Nelson and Melissa found a quiet corner to share a private moment. "We did it," Nelson said, his eyes shining with happiness. "We're finally together." Melissa nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's the start of our new life. I couldn't be happier." Meanwhile, Betty, watching her friends, felt a surge of confidence. She had taken control of her own destiny, and for the first time, she felt truly free. With Daniel by her side, she was ready to embrace her future. What do you think about this story? Leave a comment below this video. Thanks for watching.